Welcome back to our next plenary session. And we are delighted to welcome for this session, Chuck Westmoreland, who is a professor at Delta State University. And he will introduce our speaker and as well as the winner of the Book of the Year Award. So Charles Westbrook, PhD.
Thank you, Marshall. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a real privilege to be with you today. Thanks to everyone for joining us at the Mississippi Historical Society. The Mississippi Historical Society's Book of the Year Award goes to the best book on a subject related to Mississippi history or biography published in a given year. This year, I was proud to serve on this award committee with Dr. Christian Pennon, Associate Professor of History at Mississippi College, and Ms. LaToya Norman, the General Manager of the African American Military History Museum in Hattiesburg. Being on this committee was a lot of fun. We had the opportunity to read many great books in Mississippi history, and it certainly took a great deal of time and due diligence. I'm very appreciative for Christian's and LaToya's hard work, and I enjoyed serving with them. We read and discussed a series of important works in Mississippi history, but one book stood out above the rest. For its engagement with a topic of great significance, original research, captivating writing and storytelling, and an in-depth analysis steeped in the blood of racism, Black Power, Law and Order, and the 1970 shootings at Jackson State College is a most deserving choice for the 2021 MHS Book of the Year Award. I'm glad to be able to introduce the author of this outstanding book, Dr. Nancy Bristow. A professor of history at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, Dr. Bristow earned her BA in history from Colorado College and both the MA and PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. At Puget Sound, she teaches courses in 20th century US history with an emphasis on race, gender, and social change. She has twice received the Outstanding Faculty Award from the Associated Students of Puget Sound. She has extensive publications prior to Steeped in the Blood of Racism, most notably 2 books. The first, Making Men Moral, Social Engineering During the Great War, which was published by New York University Press. And then a book that's very relevant for us today, American Pandemic, Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, which was published by Oxford University Press. All of us interested in Mississippi history, particularly in terms of how race, law, and memory have shaped the state, owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Bristow for her foray into this vital story. Placing the Jackson State College, now university, shootings in a proper and national and local context, Bristow highlights the role of local politics and law enforcement in the perpetration of the murders. She draws on the history of the state, the city, and the university to show how racism shaped interactions between all 3 entities and how much the JSU students suffered in the process. Dr. Bristow has prepared remarks, and following those remarks, she will take questions from the audience. So please feel free to type questions in the chat, and Chris Goodwin will help facilitate the Q&A after Dr. Bristow's presentation. So please join me in congratulating and welcoming the recipient of the 2021 MHS Book of the Year Award, Dr. Nancy Bristow.
Hi, my name is Nancy Bristow, and it is truly an honor for me to be with all of you today. And I want to thank from the bottom of my heart the Mississippi Historical Society for this extraordinary honoring of my work. And especially because I think it is honoring not so much my work, but in fact the story and the people whose story this work is about, those who were at Jackson State College in May 1970. So truly, thank you so much. Before I begin my more formal remarks, I also want to thank the people of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. I live and work on unceded land that belongs to them. They are called the generous people, and so they are. And they have remained the courageous and wise stewards of the land and the sea and their own ancient heritage. And I want to name that out of respect for them and out of a commitment to their ongoing struggle for justice. And it is to a different struggle for justice then that I want to turn, and that is that story of May 15th. And I want to urge all of us to listen to remember, and to understand this story. And so I'm not here to share my own story in a sense, but here to share the story of the Jackson State community, of individuals and their families who were caught in the crosshairs of injustice when the Mississippi Highway and Safety Patrol and the Jackson City Police opened fire on unarmed young people on the Jackson State College campus. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for so many people from that campus and its broader community, people who have helped and guided and mentored me and have shared their stories with me or with others. So let me begin by thanking them, who are really at the center of all of this. I'm forever indebted and grateful to Linda Brady and her brother Robert, Darlita Ballard, Dr. Hilliard Lackey, Dr. John A. Peoples, Professor Celie McGinnis, Dr. Byron Deandra Ori, Dr. Mamie Crockett, Dr. Ivory Phillips, James Lapp Baker, Eddie Jean McDonald Carr, Dr. Robert Smith, Hillman Frazier, Lucius Edwards, Ed Swinney, Leroy Kenter, Vernon Steve Weekly, Maddie Hull, Gloria McCrae, Dale Gibbs and her sons Philip Jr. and Demetrius, Dr. Robert Luckett, and Constance Iona Slaughter Harvey. I am a better person with a fuller heart and mind because of each of you. So let me turn to the story. Sometime after about 10 p.m. on May 14th, 1970, James Earl Green, a high school senior, left his job at the Wagabag Grocery. The middle of 9 children, Green had held the job since he was 11. As he usually did, Green took a shortcut on his way home through the campus of Jackson State College, the flagship of the state's still segregated system of higher education. This was the state's lead Black college. In 1970, the campus was split down the middle by Lynch Street, a major thoroughfare that carried white suburbanites to their jobs in Jackson. The street was a constant source of danger and anxiety for the students because they had to deal with white motorists speeding through the campus and yelling racial epithets. As a result, every year since the spring of 1964, there had been some kind of confrontation between students, white motorists, and that usually resulted in an overreaction in turn by the local white police force. And it was this pattern that we saw on the night of May 13th. Rocks were thrown at commuters. Police came to campus. They closed the street to motorists. The college imposed a curfew, and the National Guard was brought to Jackson proactively, signaling the underlying, or I should say much more blatant, white supremacy of the local white police. They routinely used derogatory language to talk about and to talk to the students that night, but they stayed off the campus. And the result was that there was no injury that night. Now, when James Earl Green left work the next night, he was aware of what had happened the previous night, but the campus was a shortcut home. So sometime after midnight, early on the morning now of May 15th, he was still on the campus, standing directly across from Alexander Hall, watching an escalating situation. Earlier that evening, renewed unrest had emerged on the campus near Stewart Hall. The reasons were unclear and perhaps quite varied. Some students mentioned the war in Vietnam and the expansion into Cambodia. Many students were concerned that their campus was inadequately funded. A rumor had circulated as well that Charles Evers and his wife had been murdered. That wasn't true. Most likely, though, as an explanation for the unrest was the ongoing problem of Lynch Street. And sometime around 9:30, some students or some local youths did throw some rocks at motorists. They even set a dump truck on fire. But that action brought 40 members of the Mississippi Highway and Safety Patrol and the Jackson Police to campus. Because when the fire department brought a fire truck to campus, they believed they needed to be, quote, protected from the students. Well, they didn't have any trouble dousing the fire, and they were not bothered by the students as they did so. And they then left and proceeded around the perimeter of the campus. That's what law enforcement was supposed to do as well. But instead, they marched straight through the middle of campus. They marched up Lynch Street in a phalanx and stopped in front of Alexander Hall. Eddie G. McDonald was the recently elected Miss Jackson State, and she was leaning out her window with her roommate, Mary Gibbs. They were talking to her, Mary Gibbs's brother, Philip. He was one of scores of young men that were hanging out in front of the dorm, gathered, chatting with their friends, and talking through the window with young women who, because of an 11:30 curfew, had been pulled back indoors. As Larry Breland described it, it was a warm May night. It was close to graduation. Students were excited about that. And everybody was, he said, just chilling out. Philip Gibbs was still at his sister's first floor window when law enforcement arrived. They stopped at the dorm's west wing, turned, pointed their weapons at the dormitory and the students gathered outside, and also shined a spotlight up on it. And then Eddie G. McDonald heard a sound. It wasn't a gunshot, she said, but something like a bottle breaking. And then she says it started. She recalled instantaneously, by the time that bottle hit, all hell, everything broke out. The Jackson Police and the Mississippi Highway and Safety Patrol had opened fire on the students, spraying the shots up and down the side of the dormitory and into the students gathered in front. They fired for 28 seconds. They left more than 400 bullet holes and buckshot marks on the side of the dorm. And when they stopped, two young men, James Earl Green and Philip Lafayette Gibbs, lay dying, and 12 other students were injured. In the days to come, students from the college fought to preserve what they saw as the most significant evidence of the assault, and that was the bullet-marked exterior and the windows of Alexander Hall. The first night, hundreds of students stayed in front of the dorm. They closed the college, sent the students home, suspended the campus for the remainder of the semester. Nevertheless, a number of students stayed in front of the dorm and maintained a vigil. When workers from the highway patrol's crime lab arrived, they wouldn't let them take the evidence. When a judge tried to intervene, they burned his report in the street. As one student exclaimed when the state workers first arrived, "Don't you see what they're doing? They're taking these scars away." And the students wouldn't let them. The students finally stepped aside on May 23rd, but only after the U.S. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights promised that the evidence would be taken directly to the FBI and that the students could observe the removal. For 8 days, the students had acted to preserve both evidence and memory. Though the white community would soon forget the shootings, Jackson's Black community, and especially the community of Jackson State, has worked hard to ensure that this story was remembered. At the second commemoration of the shootings, Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander asked, "Must we forget so soon, or do we remember?" She knew memory work had to be done, and she urged students, the campus, to remember what had taken place, and especially to remember the lives of James Earl Green and Philip Lafayette Gibbs. Charging her audience to never forget those martyred men, she wondered, how best can we memorialize these two young men? And she had an answer. "We must," she said, "recall those painful hours and re-examine what happened here if we would understand our lives today and what is happening to us now." And though almost a century has passed since she expressed those words, her call to look at this terrible event and the meaning it holds in the present resonates powerfully in this historical moment as well. And so I want to turn to Dr. Alexander's charge to look at the shootings and to make clear the role played by white supremacy in causing these murders. And then finally, I want to articulate how fully our lives remain bound up with this past. Well, to suggest that racism was at the heart of the shootings is very easy to prove. In fact, in 1970, only 19 of the 279 officers of the Jackson Police Force were Black. The Highway Patrol had yet to hire a single African-American patrolman. Some locals referred to the Highway Patrol as the segregationist army, and both forces were well known to include Klan members. The on-site commander of the Mississippi Highway and Safety Patrol that night was named Lloyd Jones, but he was nicknamed Goon Jones by the Black community for the mistreatment he routinely meted out. And according to a Department of Justice investigation, it's likely that he was the man who fired the fatal bullet in 1967 when a local civil rights activist, Benjamin Brown, was shot dead near the edge of the Jackson State campus. So the officers that approached the campus that night came with a perception of the students shaped by their own white supremacy. And we can see this in the weapons they carried. They had weapons better suited to warfare, frankly, than crowd control. The highway patrol brought shotguns loaded with double-aught buckshot, the police shotguns with number 1 shot. Asked why they chose these weapons, Lloyd Jones responded that it was because they looked mean. Allowed to bring their own personal ammunition, some members of the highway patrol brought military ammunition, including armor-piercing bullets. The city police brought 2 9mm submachine guns so that they would be able to show, quote, excessive force. And they brought Thompson's tank, a vehicle added to the city's armory in 1964 with the express purpose of combating civil rights activism. When they arrived on campus, in turn, the officers continually misjudged the situation and as a result exaggerated their sense of the kind of danger that existed. Because they had a white supremacist view of the young people, they worried, for instance, that the students were going to burn down buildings. One officer suggested that they were going to burn the town down. Trained to see the students as a threat, they looked out, they came to the campus, and they saw a riot where there wasn't one. And maybe that's why they inexplicably marched down Lynch Street to the middle of campus, which made no sense given the quiet scene at Alexander Hall. But this decision was just one in a litany of failures that night. Failures based in white supremacy and in a disregard for the students' well-being. Both the police and the Highway Safety Patrol, for instance, rushed to the campus without briefing about their mission, without conversation about the relationship between the forces. Both forces were supposed to withdraw when the National Guard arrived. Both failed to do so. Officers would claim that they were endangered by the students at Alexander Hall, that they were being confronted by rock throwing. Well, the bulk of the evidence disagrees. First of all, no state troopers or policemen were hospitalized. None of the 4 reporters present at the scene remembered seeing more than a couple of things tossed. And in fact, no extra cleanup was required on Lynch Street, which of course there would have been had the barrage that the officers suggest happened had occurred. Now, importantly though, even if students and other young people had been throwing rocks or bricks or bottles, protocol would not permit opening fire. And that may explain the emergence of that rumor that there was a sniper. Now again, let me be clear, there is no evidence that there was a sniper. There was no sniper. State security officers, the mayor, the on-site commanders of both the National Guard and the Jackson Police all report they didn't hear a shot prior to the shooting of the officer's volley. The FBI also found no evidence of a sniper. But once more, it's crucial to note that even if there had been a sniper, opening fire on an unarmed crowd contradicts law enforcement protocol. It did in 1970 and it does today. Given how inexplicable the shootings were, many people at the Jackson State campus assumed it had been planned. One reporter on the scene had a different take, but assumed that they had to be shooting blanks. The president of the college figured they were firing tear gas. The on-site commander of the National Guard, when he realized what was going on, exclaimed, "My God, they've done it all wrong." And indeed they had. As the President's Commission on Campus Unrest reported of the massacre, the 28-second fusillade from police officers was an unreasonable, unjustified overreaction and was completely unwarranted. The tragedy of this moment is made all the deeper if I put it in its larger context, I think, because this violence wasn't a singular event, but rather a chapter in the long history of white supremacist violence that reaches all the way back to the nation's origins. It was essential, for instance, in the institution of slavery. And the persistent efforts of the Black community to fight for freedom and the gains these efforts produced have repeatedly brought a brutal, violent backlash. This was the case, for instance, with the ending of slavery. It was true in the post-Reconstruction period, and it was true throughout the civil rights and Black Power eras. This racist backlash against African-American gains was the context for the shootings at Jackson State. The civil rights movement and the Black Power movements had actually brought important changes, whether you talk about the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, or a series of Supreme Court decisions that outlawed poll taxes, found segregation unconstitutional, and ruled that you could not prohibit interracial marriages. Now, the campus of Jackson State did have a reputation as being relatively inactive through this period. It's not an entirely accurate imagery. First of all, it's important to note that the campus was controlled by an all-white board of trustees, and as a result, for many years, the presidents of the institution kept a tight lid on activism on campus. That doesn't mean there wasn't activism, only that those activists often faced really harsh penalties, including expulsions. By 1967, though, things had begun to change with the arrival of the new president, Dr. John A. Peoples. And so that by 1970, a number of things were transitioning. He called for, in fact, a revolution in our books. And we saw it happening. African-American studies was being cautiously added to the curriculum. Students had created an Afro-American society on the campus. What has become the Margaret Walker Center opened, and the Blue and White Flash campus newspaper increasingly ran stories that talked about important social issues and that called on students to be active and celebrated Blackness. When Eddie Jean McDonald, for instance, was elected Miss Jackson State, as you saw in that earlier picture, she and her court were the first to wear dresses inspired by an African aesthetic. It was this campus, imagining and striving and gaining new opportunities, that was the site of the deadly assault. And Jackson State wasn't the only target. By the spring of 1970, the repression of students at HBCUs was already on the rise, and the shootings at Jackson State College were part of what one scholar has described as a rising tide of lethal police assaults on Black college campuses. As just one example, in February of 1968, police opened fire on students at South Carolina State College in Orangeburg. These students had been protesting segregation at a local bowling alley, but were actually on their own campus when police approached them and opened fire. They killed 3 young people and injured another 27. And as they did at Jackson State, they would falsely claim that they'd been involved in a heavy exchange of gunfire. In all, at least 13 young African Americans were killed in police assaults against Black students in the late 60s and early 70s. And it wasn't only students that were facing this harsh repression. In 1969, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party were murdered by the Chicago police. Murders again explained away, in a sense, with false claims of a shootout. Again, a false claim. And just a few days prior to the shootings at Jackson State College in Augusta, Georgia, police had again claimed they were endangered and as a result had killed 6 Black men. The reality is that all 6 of those men had been shot in the back. If this violence was a culmination of a long and ongoing historical pattern, the justifications for it had been retooled by 1970. Thanks to the civil rights and Black power movements, racism, though it was still widely embraced, of course, could not be as brazenly proclaimed. Over the course of the 1960s, white supremacists were forced to develop a new language to appeal to white racial fears and to name their concerns about race without naming them directly. They developed something called the law and order narrative or viewpoint or position, and it served their purposes perfectly. In 1964, Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate for president, turned to, quote, crime in the streets, unquote, as a major campaign issue. He was trying to attract white voters with the notion that crime was coded as Black. George Wallace made it clear that even a segregationist, an outspoken segregationist, could make it on the national scene as long as he modified his racial animus to embrace a more subtle version of white supremacy. Again, this law and order narrative. And it was Richard Nixon, of course, who most perfected this tactic with what he called his Southern strategy, in which he used this law and order perspective to lure the white South into the Republican Party. While generally avoiding explicit and direct attention or naming of race, the law and order rhetoric appealed very purposely to white fear, unease that had been enhanced exponentially by civil rights gains. And the overreaction then at Jackson State College on May 14th, 15th reflected this perspective, as white officers viewed the students as both dangerous and criminal and approached them with arms more appropriate for a military siege and showed no regard for the students' well-being. Unfortunately, in the aftermath, law enforcement would then justify the shootings with the same kind of language. Both the federal and Hinds County grand juries recast the shootings as a defense against what one judge termed the complete breakdown of law and order, or what the governor framed as part and parcel, he said, of a well-planned and carefully executed revolution against our American institutions. In the civil trial, the state argued that law enforcement and the white community were the victims. Both the criminal and civil justice systems failed the real victims of the assault, the young people at Jackson State. No officers were ever charged, and no compensation was ever paid to those young people and their families who suffered through the shootings. So what does this all have to do with us here, 51 almost years later? Well, first, the law and order view used to justify the shootings and later to justify them, and that have gone on, in a sense, to continue to shape public policy. So they caused the shootings, they justified the shootings, and then the same attitudes have been used for decades subsequently. Think, for instance, of the assault on social programs or the war on drugs. Think of what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow that has led to this carceral state in which unfathomable numbers of people of color have been imprisoned. All of this made possible by a law and order perspective. And remember, it has also allowed the continuation of the murder of Black citizens by law enforcement and the abdication of our criminal justice system to punish the perpetrators. This continued crisis has only been possible, I would say, because of the failure of memory of events like the Jackson State shootings. And by memory, I really mean white American memory. To remember what happened at Jackson State College in 1970 would require an understanding of the long history of white supremacist violence and would have demanded that the nation consider it as a crisis, the crisis that those shootings really did reflect. The story of what happened at Jackson State College a half century ago reminds us that we must not treat each of these deaths at the hands of law enforcement as isolated incidents, but must instead acknowledge the long historical arc of state-sanctioned violence of which each one, including the shootings at Jackson State, have been a part. It's hard to face this past. But as the great James Baldwin told us in 1963, an invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to those who loved Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green to remember shootings, especially to remember these young men. And so also must we remember Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and more. Because only if we remember these murders, if we remember these stories like that of Jackson State, like that of Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green, only then do we have a chance at stopping these horrific assaults. Thank you for listening, and thank you for lifting up the story of these young people. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Nancy. Let me see if I can get my video going this time. Yeah. I'm sorry that we couldn't get the sound up a little bit higher for everyone, but I trust everyone could hear it well enough. Can you all hear me? Good.
Yes.
All right. Nancy, could you talk to us a little bit about the path that this case took through the court system and the ultimately unsatisfying end of that?
Absolutely. And as I mentioned just at the tail end of the presentation, there never was satisfaction in the courts. So there were a number of sort of investigations. There was an enormous amount of evidence collected. The President's Commission on Campus Unrest did an extraordinary level of interviewing of literally hundreds and hundreds of people. The FBI was involved in those investigations. The mayor of Jackson, in fact, had an investigation into it. And repeatedly, the investigations would find, as the President's Commission did, that this was an unwarranted, unjustified assault. And yet that was never the result in the courts. So the Hinds County grand jury and the federal grand jury would each take on the investigation as they're supposed to do. The federal grand jury had as its judge, unfortunately, Judge Cox, who was well known in Mississippi for his racism. He had used the N-word in court. He had routinely lambasted civil rights organizers and had been one of the people, or had been the judge, in fact, who had dropped the charges against several of those involved in the 1964 shootings during Freedom Summer. So this was an automatic signal that this was not going to work out at the federal level. And in fact, his sort of proclamations and his speeches to the jury before they went in to do their deliberations made it very clear that he had expectations that they would not bring charges. And they not only didn't bring charges, but they didn't even write a report. The Hinds County grand jury sort of adopted a lot of the same kind of language, which absolutely framed the students as the criminals, law enforcement as, they would use language like good people like you. And remember, of course, you're dealing with primarily white jurors, of course. And again, no charges against the officers were leveled. As a result, the only route that the families and the victims had was to go to civil court, which they did. Constance Slaughter Harvey, who many of you know, was the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Mississippi Law School, and who has been a tremendous source for those of us interested in this history, a great support to me. Immediately spoke with the students. I mean, literally immediately the next morning, she tried to get on campus that night and they wouldn't allow her. And she took on their case. And they eventually did have a trial. An all-white jury found for the state and for all the officers. On appeal, they were actually able to get they got a decision in their favor, but sovereign immunity covered everyone who was being challenged in the court, all of the defendants. So there was, again, no compensation paid, and they took it to the Supreme Court and were unable to get a hearing there. So literally there was never any compensation, and there was never any charges filed against the officers who did this. And I think that was very hard. Not that money or a success in the court would take away the agony of what people had been through. But it is my sense from speaking with folks that the failures of the systems were really very, very devastating for people.
Mr. Charles Clark asks a question. Could you comment on the impact of the information system on this event? It would be a lot harder to do this now with social media.
That's exactly right. It's such an important point. People have often asked me, so why did this shooting get forgotten so easily? Was it because it happened at night and there weren't good photographs? I think that, in fact, the information systems didn't necessarily let down the students at Jackson State. If local media, the local white media, was not supportive of at all of the students, the national media often was, and the story of the shootings at Jackson State got extraordinary coverage in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine. They were on a PBS special the next year. Playboy magazine had a 10-page spread on them on the 1-year anniversary, but it was never the same level of coverage, of course, that the Kent State shootings got. Kent State shootings happened 10 days earlier, and it was very clear that there was a racial dynamic involved. And so the information system did cover the story more than I had expected to find, but never with the same sort of centering of the story. For instance, it wasn't on, it wasn't a banner headline in the New York Times like the Kent State shootings were. So always race was a factor in getting this story out. And yet the reality is that it was news. People did see this story in 1970. And so again, we have to keep going back to the idea that not only were the shootings caused and justified by racism, but so also was this forgetting. Because if you ask a class of college students, for instance, in 2021, how many of them have heard of Kent State, and many students will raise their hands. And if I ask up here in the Pacific Northwest, how many have heard of the Jackson State shootings, I'm lucky to get a student or two. And if I do, it's often a student of color, and often they were told about it by their parents, not by the education system. So again, it's racism that was really essential in the forgetting of this story. And even the idea that it was because there weren't good photographs like there were of the shootings at Kent State, I don't agree, because there are. And even though I think the point is well said by one of the people, Mr. Charles Clark pointed out that the photos don't actually do justice to the horror. They are nevertheless really quite powerful photographs, some of them. And I think, again, those photographs were seen by many Americans, and yet the white community simply lost the story. And for me, that was part of the motivation then for writing my book. Oh, can I say something really quickly? This is totally off topic, but in doing my thanks, I forgot someone very important, and talking about the photographs brings her to mind. Dr. Doris Derby, who was a faculty member at Jackson State at the time and a great photographer, not only allowed me to use some of her photographs in my book, but I think it was also a really important person in helping keep the memory alive because of the photographs that she took, both at an open hearing that happened at the Masonic Temple, and also at the funeral for James Earl Green. And she did some really important recording of this history. And I apologize that I neglected her name in my list of thank yous. I'm going to blame, I'm going to blame Zoom brain for it, I guess. Sorry.
No, that's
thank you
enough.
for letting me get that in there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, a great friend of the department as well. It seems like a good time to mention as well that one of the points in your book is that in the national understanding of the Jackson State shootings, at least, there was a misunderstanding of the nature of it, that it really was not Kent State 2 in the way that it was really presented.
Chris, that's such an important point. Thank you for making it. I think that was really important, that for many in the white community, and I'm thinking here not so much of those who were hostile to civil rights, those who would have been hostile to the students, but rather the liberal white community who very much were saddened by what had happened at Jackson State, nevertheless didn't really understand it. It was much more comfortable in a sense to say that this was just like Kent State, and not to actually look at the way racism was really implicated. I think it made for a much more comfortable sense of alliance, but an alliance that I think too often neglected the real source of the violence for the students at Jackson State, which was that they were young Black Americans who were getting higher education in a state that was at that time perhaps the most racially repressive state in the Union. So thank you for bringing that up, because another thing I've really wanted to do is to make that point, that to call it Kent State 2, which unfortunately national press often did, is just a miscommunication about the realities. Interestingly, one of the places where that understanding, I think, was made and has continued is actually at Kent State. There was, in fact, and I think remains, a sense of connection between the students who were on those two campuses at the time of this violence, but also an understanding that they both faced violence, but it wasn't from the same causes. So very interesting that that sense of partnership, I think, was based in something that was much deeper than what the rest of the national community really could see or understand.
Yeah. We have a question from William Vaughn. He asks, were the cops marching through the campus the idea of the Jackson Police or the State Highway Patrol?
It's fairly unclear exactly what was going on. In fact, the city police should have been in charge, but neither of them should have been on campus at that point. They were called in to protect the firefighters while they doused the dump truck in front of Stewart Hall. Just a side note about that, that may seem like a dramatic action, setting a dump truck on fire, but I think it has to be put in the context of May 1970. Remember that this is a time when campuses nationwide are shut down in a national student strike, and all kinds of things are happening on campuses. The burning of a dump truck was really a minor event in the context of that spring. And so the police arriving to protect the firefighters right away gives us a signal that there was so much fear among those law enforcement institutions of the students, that they raced to campus and didn't talk about the mission or the collaboration between the forces. They were to withdraw as soon as the National Guard arrived, and they failed to do so because they hadn't briefed their people, and because they were in such a hurry, they were in such a panic. And then in turn, the city police should have been in charge that evening. And in fact, it appears that it was much more the state patrol that was in the lead in this action. And certainly they were the ones who were most likely to have fired their weapons as well in front of Alexander Hall. Many of the city police didn't actually fire. It appears, though, both forces picked up shells and did not have a record of who had which weaponry, and so completely messed with what I would call a crime scene, making it really hard to pull apart what took place that night. But not surprisingly, the highway patrol seems to have been the motivator here. And again, the presence of Officer Jones, I think, is really an important piece of the story. An officer who some years later would actually die at the hands of a gunshot. He would be murdered later in his life after he had left Jackson.
And Nancy, were you able to draw on interviews and oral histories with participants on the law enforcement side for any of this?
Very little. It's one of the things that's very interesting about how memory works. Now, again, I was lucky because there was such a extraordinary collection of sources available, these thousands of interviews conducted by both the President's Commission and the FBI, that there was much material. There were also the full records of the Mayor's Commission, of the President's Commission, of hearings that were held in Jackson by the President's Commission. So there's an extraordinary amount of material to work with. What's really interesting is in the aftermath, there are a lot of oral histories done. The campus does some. I did over 40 myself. And even on anniversaries, there were often interviews that would appear in the press, especially the local press, or literally on Jackson State's campus. But in all of that, the voices of law enforcement dissipate. I literally found only a couple of places where law enforcement was interviewed. And in both cases, they did not claim responsibility or acknowledge what had really happened, continued to talk about a narrative of being in danger, and didn't want to talk about it. In both cases, the interviews were a sentence or two. I was able to talk to one member of the Jackson police, a Black member of the police force, who actually joined with the students in the belief that this may have been a planned attack, and felt that he had been kept to the borders of campus that night precisely so that this kind of thing could happen. So the lone person I was able to speak to from the police of 1970 was a Black officer who was not on site, but was on the edge of campus at the time of the shooting. And again, I think it speaks to the ways in which what was acceptable has evolved. I think today, police opening fire on students who weren't really doing anything except enjoying a warm May evening would be so unacceptable. But it's quite striking to me the ways in which that narrative has persisted without it being pushed by the law enforcement officers themselves that were implicated in this crime.
But in the contemporary time there, the municipal administration, the mainstream media, the white media, successfully sort of flipped the narrative so that the victims were painted as the aggressors.
Right. No, that's right. That's what's so horrific, really, about reading some of the local press coverage. They're literally, I think the one that was most heartbreaking to read, somebody wrote, it was somebody from New Orleans, not somebody directly local, but nearby, and wrote into one of the local papers, obviously controlled by the Hetterman family, which was, so the papers were well known for their white supremacy, and said simply, congratulations to the police for their actions. And it's like how you could think in those terms. And again, you have to then step back and go, okay, so this is what that racialized narrative of white supremacy looks like. And according to that, these students were inherently dangerous and criminal, And so, of course, the police were only doing the quote right thing. And you can see this again and again and again in the way the police talk about what they did and in the ways that the press covered the story. And again, one of the things that was hardest to do was reading the trial testimony. So the students have taken to court members of the Highway Patrol, of the Jackson Police, and in fact, the leadership of both the city and the state. And so the defendants are these officers. And yet in the courtroom, the treatment of the officers is very respectful. They are routinely referred to as Mr., talked about, always asked about, like, how much family did you have? Did you serve in the military? And then when the young Black students are on the stand, and I realize this is what you do in a courtroom, and yet the treatment was so horrific. Routinely, the students are asked things like, they would be asked to repeat some of the epithets they heard expressed that night. And so you would have a white jury listening to young Black people saying out loud the things that they had yelled at police officers, even though they weren't the ones who had yelled them necessarily. But when the police officers were asked about what they'd heard, they were allowed to say, oh, I don't want to say those kinds of words in the courtroom. And so in the courtrooms, the students were put in the position, they're asked questions like, Leroy Kenter, who had suffered one of the worst injuries, was in the hospital for more than a month, went home in a half body cast on a hot Mississippi summer. It was just a terrible thing. He had a shattered femur. It really affected his life in important ways. Was asked in the courtroom, do you have an alias? Do you go by an alias sometimes? Because he had a nickname, right? His friends called him Spoon. So again, this sort of treatment of the young people as if they were criminals. And they simply were not. These were just young college students aspiring to better futures for themselves and for their families. People who have gone on to have remarkable lives, as I document a little bit in the book. And these were extraordinary young people. And then the two that were lost were young people with great visions for their futures. And so to depict them somehow as the criminals and the white community and law enforcement as victims is literally that flipping of the story. I think somebody put in the chat that it feels familiar to nowadays, Ms. Baldwin, when there's a lot of concern about cars being burnt, but not for people who are murdered. And you really see that back in 1970 as well. And yet what the students had done, the kids down at Alexander Hall had literally done nothing. And I got to tell you, one dump truck is just, again, in the context of 1970, that's not something over which you needed to bring a phalanx of heavily armed officers. So it's really a very tragic way that the story went down in terms of this, what I'm calling the law and order narrative, because it allows for that flipping of the story. And it fits right in with the language of victimization that we still hear too often, I'm afraid, out of the white community.
You're muted, Chris.
I apologize. I thought I had unmuted. Sammy Giles asks, what effects this event had on the operations of Jackson State?
Oh, that's a really important question. The president and board of trustees shut down the campus immediately, and students were sent home. So one really important thing that happened is there was no graduation in the spring of 1970. So students who were there on that campus, many of whom were seniors there in front of Alexander Hall, didn't have a graduation. And one of the things that's really unfortunate about the COVID pandemic, of course, the greatest tragedy is the loss of lives, but Jackson State was having a commemoration of that 50th anniversary, and those students were to receive degrees and walk across that stage for their own graduation on the 50th anniversary. And doctorates, honorary doctorates, are to be given to the families of James Earl Green and Philip Lafayette Gibbs. And that celebration / commemoration had to be canceled. But those events will take place this coming spring on May 15th, which is really remarkable and a testimony to so many people from that era and to some of the leadership at Jackson State today, people like Robert Luckett and Professor McGinnis. In terms of the well-being of the campus, it actually continued to thrive. And it would continue to grow and grow and grow into the major university that it is today. It would become Jackson State University a few years later. President Peoples would marshal the school into a great deal of growth, both curricularly and in terms of the physical plant. And I think for him, in fact, one of the things I think has long bothered him is that for so many people, the only thing they want to ask him about are these shootings, when Jackson State and its alums have gone on to accomplish so much. So again, that's why I wanted to start with my thanks to that campus and to so many of the young people who really were there then and have gone on to be real leaders in their communities all around the country, and especially, I think, in the state of Mississippi and in Jackson.
We're getting close to the top of the, or the close of the program, but I think we have time for a couple more questions. Nancy, what was the coverage like, and what was the understanding for white Mississippians and Black Mississippians about the event in the days after it happened, in the immediate aftermath?
And here again, you have, I don't want to overgeneralize, because when I say white Americans' memory and white Mississippians, obviously that is a diverse community, just as the Black community is Black communities, and there is great diversity within both of the communities. One thing that's fairly clear, though, is that nationwide, African American alums of Jackson State, HBCUs across the country, Black student unions at colleges all over the country, the civil rights activists and organizations all felt tremendous anger and sadness about what had happened at Jackson State, and felt a tremendous sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, community with Jackson State. And that's evident in an extraordinary file held in the archives, both at MDAH and at Jackson State, where the originals reside. Just an extraordinary outpouring of grief and sorrow and sense of partnership that was sent to the president. I mean, literally hundreds of telegrams and what are they called? Telexes, I think, which is an old-fashioned thing we don't have anymore, and cards, and just handwritten cards, beautiful cards. People just really felt this. It was one more in this long history. And there was an understanding that this was part of a past. People compared it to slavery. People compared it to lynching. People compared it to the Nazi death camps. People really talked about this as a white supremacist act based in white supremacist thinking, and really sought for the violent assault that it was. And that was pretty standard across Black communities, both locally and nationally. In white communities, there's a tremendous range. So you have, on the one hand, the people who are defending the police and see this as a protection of the white community. And then all the way around to, as I think someone also mentioned in the chat, Mr. Clark mentioned that Millsap students actually held protest marches and came over and helped to protect that dormitory, and felt a sense of connection and wanted to stand alongside the Jackson State students. So it's not that there were no white people who stood up and expressed their sense of horror and outrage and even acted on that. There were people doing that in Jackson, including Millsap students. And there's some remarkable photographs actually in the Sovereignty Commission files that show like circles around the white kids and identifiers of who they are that had gone to that protest. So it's not that this wasn't, it was a real statement to show up for one of these protests in 1970. So it's really a widely ranging set of expressions. Again, I think the most common reaction that I want to call attention to is that one that's more complex, which is a sense of identification, but a misunderstanding of the racial impetus for the crime. And that, again, was so common in the white liberal community, and something that, again, I think we have to keep pushing back against, because it's the forgetting of the racial impetus for so much of the violence against the Black communities that has made possible the continuation of that violence, I think.
In the minute or so, 2 minutes that we have left, one of the most striking aspects of the story to me is the presence of mind, the bravery, the determination of Jackson State students to identify the significance of the site, to prevent the authorities from removing that evidence. I wonder if you could just say a few words about that.
I think that's so important. It's the perfect place to come back to as we finish, which is that this story is about those people. This story is about the bravery and the courage and the lives and the losses suffered that night, early in the morning of May 15th in front of Alexander Hall, and the heroic effort of those young people to not allow the story to be lost. They clearly understood this assault for what it was, and they were not going to make it possible for the authorities to cover it up. And it is because of their courage, I think, that we are able to know the story. They would not allow that evidence to be taken and destroyed, which I'm sure is what would have happened. Okay, historians don't like to make predictions, but I think you understand the context for this, which is that there had been historically so much covering up of state crimes against Black communities, and the students wouldn't let that happen. And they have continued to commemorate this day, May 15th or May 14th, depending on who you ask, for decades, every year. I mean, this is a memory that is alive because of those young people at Jackson State College and their allies, whether those are parents or students from other schools or some of the faculty and staff from Jackson State, and increasingly administrators as well, certainly. We have to continue to thank them because that took real courage. It meant taking risk, and it was about telling the truth and putting a truth out there that was not always popular with many people. So again, I think what I appreciate most about this award is that it lifts up not me, not my work, not my book, but this story, and really the story of those young people who were, as I say, remarkable then and went on to have remarkable lives doing really important work for our communities, despite what had happened to them, and perhaps in part because of. They took this on in many cases as a challenge. They were not going to be set back by the state's assault. And that is something that shows a kind of courage and resilience and strength, and frankly, wisdom that should never have been asked of them. But we're lucky, nevertheless, that they stepped up and did all of that hard memory work for all of us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Nancy, thank you. We owe you a debt of gratitude for telling the story in the way that you have with the fullness of it. Thank you for speaking with us today about it. Congratulations on your well-deserved award.
Thank you. No, thank you.
Marshall, do you want to tell folks what's coming up next?
Yes, I can do that. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Chuck, for that presentation. We have at 1:30 another session. It's called Student Activism in the Civil Rights Movement. And it will start at 1:30. So if you will, you'll have to disconnect here, then come back and reconnect with Zoom to access that. So we look forward to seeing everyone in a few minutes.
I am going to show the awards video real quick as well, Marshall. So if people want to stick around for that, they can. Feel free to.
Oh, is that now? Oh,
Indeed.
stay tuned.